Hello, everybody. My name is Michael DeWild. Welcome to this webinar. It's in a series of webinars on the university and public trust. I am the director of the Cousy Business Ethics Initiative here at the Seidman College of Business, Grand Valley State University. We're in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Today's webinar, the title is, "What is the purpose of the university?" We'll try to narrow that down a little bit once we get started. And I'm happy to be joined by three members of the faculty and administration here at Grand Valley State University.
My name is Dwayne Tunstall. I'm a professor in the philosophy department at Grand Valley State University. I am also the Associate Dean for Inclusive Excellence in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences.
Andrew Spear. I'm in the philosophy department here at Grand Valley.
I'm Alicia Davis. I'm Assistant Vice President for the Social Justice Centers and the Director of the Office of Multicultural Affairs, as well as have been a professor at Grand Valley for quite some time.
Okay, the purpose of the university. One of the reasons that I wanted to organize that and invited the three people here on the panel to join me is for at least a decade now, there's been a fairly contentious conversation back and forth, sometimes along political lines, sometimes not, about what a university truly should be for. Criticism comes to us from a number of different perspectives. One, that it's not really worth the money anymore. And two, the one that we're most concerned with today, that it's a bastion of leftist thinking, that it doesn't represent the culture, that it indoctrinates students, that it does any number of things that both innovate and perpetuate what sometimes gets referred to as woke and or cancel culture. And I hope we have a chance maybe to define those things, since it's not clear to me that anybody really knows what they're talking about. But one of the things that does come up, the media certainly cherry picks and presents to us on a fairly regular basis stories that come out of universities that seem absurd on the face of them in terms of what people have gotten themselves in trouble for. One example after another, and we'll probably refer to some of those as well. But the launching point for today's conversation is a 2016 talk that a moral psychologist named Jonathan Haidt gave at Duke University. Haidt has made a real name for himself, not only in his research around happiness and political divisiveness and the way that relates to personalities and personality profiles, but then more recently with a number of articles, books, and talks on what's happened to the university and what's happening here in terms of its, again, overwhelming perspectives, what's happening to the students, the sense in which, again, as he says, it perpetuates a victimhood culture and that it prejudices certain values over others. And his call in the 2016 talk at Duke was that universities really need to take a stand. They need to put a stake in the ground around whether or not it's their primary mission, their primary purpose will be to bring about a better world, to emphasize social justice as their quote-unquote sacred value, or, and he sets this up as an absolute dichotomy, or the traditional notion of what a university was for veritas or truth, that the pursuit of truth is the sacred value. And his argument, I won't reiterate the entire thing here, but the argument throughout his talk is that you really can't have both. That if it's truth, that's one kind of university, and that it's going to operate under a different set of both principles and methods. If it's social justice, then that's going to be yet another set. Just brief definitions of that. What you want or he says what's inherent and prevalent in a university that is devoted to truth is this kind of disconfirmation or this notion in which any one scholar all by him or herself is probably going to be subject to biased reasoning. What you want is a community of scholars that can check each other in the pursuit of what is something close to the objective truth, no matter the field. And he said that runs up against a social justice agenda that, while social justice is great, he's certainly all for it, nonetheless, truth might be subjugated to certain ends, political ends, psychological ends of those who champion it, and is less likely to be subject to the same kind of critical scrutiny that a university based on truth or the pursuit of truth is. So I'm going to start by asking each one of the panelists to, they've read the article, we've talked about it beforehand, and I'd like to just start by asking them to get their kind of big, sort of 30,000 foot perspective on this notion of Haidt's dichotomy. This talk and transcript of it has become quite influential, and it's I think it probably matters what universities think in terms of pursuing one or the other, or whether or not he's engaging in false dichotomies. So I'm going to turn it over to Dwayne first. We'll go down the line here and get people's take on that before we get more into the weeds.
I don't usually like to begin the discussion of someone's thought by identifying what I consider to be an informal fallacy in their reasoning, but I have to do so in this context. Not because I just want to point out, oh, someone I disagree with has committed a logical fallacy, therefore we can dismiss what he's saying. Actually, I am sympathetic to many of the things that he said in his 2016 speech, especially with respect to the tendency of at least some proponents of social justice to take racial disparities as necessarily being evidence for unjust discrimination and oppression of certain minoritized and otherwise underrepresented groups, especially in historically white colleges and universities. The reason why I think the way that he frames social justice and truth as being a false dichotomy is that you can have the pursuit of truth when it comes to various scholars and disciplines and seek objective knowledge, which I will not criticize at this moment, but I will most likely criticize later in this discussion, while being mindful of social justice as an important feature of colleges and universities in the 21st century. Most specifically, when it comes to eliminating barriers that have excluded a lot of people who are more than intelligent enough to be in colleges and universities, but were excluded.
Andrew.
Okay. Well, that's a tough act to follow, but I'll do my best. My big picture take. I am suspicious of the strong claim about a exclusive sort of conflict or dichotomy along the line. I think Haidt is able to point to particular instances where I would probably agree with him that a mistake has been made and the social justice claims, broadly characterized, have gotten out of hand. But so I'm not on board with like the very strong dichotomous thesis of the essay. That being said, I guess two things I think are particularly valuable. I think if I'm given permission to do, which I won't do now in any great detail, but to qualify what is meant by truth a little bit, coming from sort of a philosophical standpoint here, are we just talking about empirical psychology or the social sciences? Does truth include historical truth, interpretation, understanding, the study of literature, also the kinds of truths or capacities we might be talking about in the professions, in the health sciences, for example? I want to make sure we're talking about a broad enough understanding of truth. If I can qualify in that way, then I'd say I agree that is in some sense constitutive of or essential to the mission of a university. You wouldn't be talking about a university per se if you weren't talking about an institution committed to education, research, scholarship, and discourse related to those things. I think, though, that it's a much more complicated question what the relationship of that is to what we might call social justice, especially when you think about a state or public university, such as our own, such as Grand Valley State University. So I think that, having granted a strong claim about kind of the nature of the university, I don't think that tells us all that there is to say about its mission. two other really big picture remarks. I think Haidt makes a good point about what he calls viewpoint diversity. If the university is about the intellectual enterprise and the search for truth, we want many different viewpoints represented. In fact, that is one part of the argument for equity and inclusion to begin with, that you have those different viewpoints. He raises the concern that universities, at least some universities or some university cultures, may have certain kinds of monolithic viewpoints represented, that it's actually relatively uniform in ideas or thinking or political outlook, even as it becomes more diverse in other ways. I think that's an interesting point. I think there's something there that needs to be taken into account. I'm not sure, though, that it gets him as far as he thinks either. And last but not least, and I'll say it quickly, but I think he plays off as dichotomous social justice and the pursuit of intellectual truth at the university. But I can't think we can really talk about the situation of higher education in the university today without talking about what we might call a sort of third purpose the university gets seen for, which is vocational training or jobs training or a kind of economic way of thinking about the university, which includes the funding situation of the universities and the way in which they've become more and more viewed as either profit centers or businesses, or as what I'll call, customer satisfaction, in the business of customer satisfaction. There's a number of different reasons for that and ways in which that happens, but I think that something Haidt should consider is that some of the problems he's worried about may not come from social justice per se, but from this other kind of transformation and these other pressures on the university. Okay, I'll stop there.
Wow, we've had a lot to say there. I very much don't agree with his philosophy on institutions having to be either or, a social justice university or a truth university. When we look at social justice, yes, we are absolutely looking at equitable treatment, and hopefully that produces equitable outcomes. But until we make changes at the institution that actually do overthrow power structures, that actually do minimize privilege of individuals who have had privilege over centuries of time, we're not going to get to a place where we can have those equitable outcomes. You essentially have to break the structure in order to recreate what you'd like to see. And, yes, we do want to seek truth in that. And I think part of the truth that's in the social justice framework is the fact that these systems are in place and these systems have oppressed over time, and they have created inequitable opportunities for individuals, which is why we have to continue to revisit the topic in order to try to create these equitable systems that we currently still don't have in place. Let's really call a thing. Higher education wasn't, from its foundational purpose, wasn't created for anybody except for individuals that fell into the majority group, which was white males that owned land. And so, when you look at it, there's always going to be systems in place until we essentially break those systems in order to create equitable systems, because it wasn't built for everyone, which is why we have additional institutions for other groups that have been marginalized or are part of socially devalued groups. We have, historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions. We have, tribal colleges, and those were created because these systems weren't created for those groups to begin with.
Let me get into the weeds a little bit by trying to be as fair to Haidt as possible off the bat, and I think maybe the fairest way is to actually read an excerpt from early part of the essay. Goes to something that Andrew touched on, and I'll ask for your responses to this as well. He's talking about the professoriate, faculty members, and the ratio of folks who identify as Democrats/left, and anywhere along the spectrum. And that varies a little bit department to department. If you break it down, more Democrats and left-leaning self-identified folks in the humanities than other parts of the university. But by and large, he quotes a statistic that says it's about 17-1 in terms of left-leaning to right-leaning or conservative in the country in terms of the faculty of universities. He thinks that's probably a problem for viewpoint diversity. It's also a fairly recent change that it's that much. It was always a little bit more liberal than not, but now much more so. And as at least is captured in the popular imagination, that the most left-leaning part of the left, the most radical left, if you like, has captured the agenda and the language. Here's what he thinks are some of the consequences of that. For students, I think those consequences are that orthodox views, whatever's politically pleasing to the left, become much more strongly held than they were 10 or 20 years ago, but much less weakly supported. So in terms of getting to his notion of a dichotomy, that social justice, however that's expressed, articulated by a particular aspect of the left, becomes an orthodoxy that really cannot, or even slash could not, should not be challenged. People don't know the reasons for their beliefs because they've never been challenged. Nobody dares challenge them. There is actually some evidence for this among FIRE, which is an academic freedom group that goes to bat, oftentimes in court, for professors who've been, brought up on one charge or another for not adhering to the quote-unquote orthodoxy. And the suggestion is that they self-censor to a much greater degree than ever before. So students are getting much less diversity viewpoint. He quotes John Stuart Mill, if you're not even exposed to anybody who believes the opposite, you can't know what you think you know. And secondly, that students and many moderate faculty walk on eggshells in the classroom. That's not only a problem of shifting balance in terms of who has the power over the language and the agenda of the university. It's social media as well. Nobody wants to be caught on film saying anything against the quote-unquote orthodoxy. People are afraid. They're afraid they'll be crucified on social media. They're afraid. They say mostly of each other, not so much the professors, though that happens, but as of each other. Students are walking on eggshells, and that means in your classes, students are much more afraid to speak up and disagree. And if you don't have an active, robust conversation in which everything can be put on the table, you're not going to get resilient, truth-seeking students, which is, again, from his point of view, ultimately the purpose of the university. And this really goes to anybody who wants to start.
I'm curious, when people use language such as put everything on the table, what do they, A, mean by that? And B, do they really intend for everything to be on the table when it comes to intellectual discussions in the classroom or in terms of people's research? I can imagine some things that I personally choose not to have students talk about in the classroom, precisely because if they talked about it, it would lead to other students in the classroom feeling like their very existence is being threatened. And given that we're talking about controversial issues in this podcast, I'm going to bring up my students who are trans men and trans women. It's one thing to have discussions about gender identity and people disagreeing about what they mean by gender. How do you study gender identity? Whether you're talking about the social sciences, or you're talking in terms of ethics, or you're talking in terms of healthcare. But one of the things that I inform students of is that you need to be respectful of the people in the class. You can have these controversial debates, but when it gets to the point where you deny the existence of someone who is in the classroom with you, that's where I would say you have crossed the line. Would that be part of, oh, I'm not letting students put everything on the table? Because if that's the case, and I would have to let students actively disrespect one another to have things on the table, I'm going, I guess I'm guilty of not letting everything on the table.
Yeah, I don't think you get to I don't think you get to have a classroom where you get to harm individuals that are already part of socially devalued groups. If that's walking on eggshells, then it's walking on eggshells. Yes, everyone can have diverse thoughts. Everyone can have their own opinions on things. We can talk about controversial things in the classroom. However, we don't get to harm individuals who have already been harmed within society. So I definitely agree with what you're saying there.
Alicia, as maybe devil's advocate or trying to represent him, though, if he happens to watch this, I'll apologize. He can come back. He has a much larger platform than I do. I'm sure he can handle it. But I can think of a couple examples from law school cases where faculty members have been punished in one way or another for doing really what they thought was their job, which was reading verbatim Supreme Court cases. In one case, reading the case meant saying out loud the word rape and rapist. In another one, Supreme Court case, matter of settled law, in order to inform the students and be true to the case, it was using the N-word explicitly. And in both cases. So I guess, for clarification's sake, both those could be triggering, certainly harmful. One, I would suggest probably even more than the other, but I'm not in a place to make that judgment. Can groups that have been harmed by language, or should they nonetheless understand or be helped to understand a distinction between the intellectual pursuit and the necessity of referencing some of these things in pursuit of intellectual understanding and using them, for example, in a court of law, and the way in which, of course, they've been used to harm people in the way that you referenced. And I think part of what he means by walking on eggshells these days is that nobody's really sure or clear, and so we back off more and more altogether. And so things that should be considered, studied, understood, just go missing now altogether for fear of running afoul of anybody's sensibilities or sensitivities.
I think you do have to be sensitive to the language. Someone who has taught a law and ethics class for health professionals who talks about medical racism in some of my implicit bias trainings, I talk about them. I will read different Supreme Court cases, other laws, but I'm also careful about the language. I will tailor the language. It doesn't change the meaning. I just will tailor the language and how I say things so that it doesn't, like I would not have said the N-word in reading a Supreme Court case. I would have changed that to Black African Americans. So, I just think you have to be cognizant of what is going to harm an individual in a way that's different from just reading something in a textbook and trying to make meaning out of it. The narrative piece of it is really important. So, when I talk about medical racism, I call a thing. I talk about the experimentation that was done on enslaved Africans and what was done, but I'm also careful about the language that I use in telling that story. They're still getting out of it what I intend for them to get out of it without causing additional harm to the individuals that are in the room that may identify with that particular group. Does that make sense?
It does. Andrew, you want to take that up?
Let's see. So I'm trying to go back to the original question and the quote you read from Haidt. The self-censorship was one part, and this kind of, let's call it the million benefit, the benefit of your own ideas being stronger or understood better because you've had them criticized, because you've had the opposition presented to you, right? So,
and then Alicia too raises the question of, I suppose, who gets to decide what's harmful, or do I need to sort of read the minds of everybody in the classroom to figure out what might be causing harm here?
Good. Well, so if I can try, I liked what Dwayne said about when we're looking for a cutoff point, we're looking for a line, right? That million community of inquiry, let's call it, needs to be a community of inquiry, which means every participant has to be taken seriously and treated with dignity as a participant of that community, right? So if the nature of the conversation in the classroom, if what's being said undermines some member of that community to the point where they, the question on the table is whether they can participate in that conversation because of who they are. I do think like that's a limit. That's a line. Okay, now the most obvious case would be if somebody in the room were literally advocating that. Yeah, like that I would like that professors shouldn't do that, fellow students shouldn't do that. I would not, I could not imagine running a lesson plan that way. But I would say that that's different, that undermining of the variability to participate is different than saying something that might be painful, harmful, or upsetting, right? Especially if it's simply the material of the class. So I guess a worry, and I think it does depend on the pedagogical goals, as you said they get out of that what I need them to get out of it when I modify the language in that way. I do imagine, though, if we're talking about history, and so Supreme Court cases that are a kind of history, but if we're talking about American history, if we're talking about European history, we're talking about any kind of history, sometimes the full gruesome details are part of that story, and history is upsetting, and it should be upsetting to all of us. And I guess I hesitate there. I feel like it's one thing to quote as opposed to quote, these were views that were held, here's what they said. And I feel like in the present, if we, as educators, never convey that to students, I feel like that something is lost there, some knowledge is lost there. That would be my concern. But I do think it depends on the pedagogical context. I mean, it shouldn't be gratuitous, and it should be done in the context where there's always this understanding of a fundamental respect for the participants in that, again, like I'll call it the million community, just because that's the quote I use.
His concern, to pick that up, as a moral psychologist, he references any number of, quite a few studies and in his field, where he says the result of this kind of treatment, changing language, avoiding certain things because of potential harm, quote, many students become intellectually fragile. If you've never had to defend your ideas and then suddenly you're challenged, it feels like a phrase that some use, this goes to exactly what you said, Dwayne, you've invalidated my existence. Students now say that. If you challenge a core conviction, they say you've invalidated my existence. That's a form of violence, so we can't allow that. We can't allow a speaker on campus who might do that. So I think I'm going to try to get with the spirit of what he's saying and see if there's a relevant distinction here. I don't think he or any reasonable person would condone hate speech, right? In which I'm making an ad hominem attack directly on a person on the basis of identifying as trans or anything like that. That category seems to me a set aside for him, I think. All right, but these other core convictions, in which, if I find it upsetting or harmful for you to talk about some aspect of American history, and I just don't want to deal with that because maybe I'm on the wrong side of it. Is there a kind of bending to the arc of this line of argument coming from students? And he's really clear in his talks that he thinks most of this is coming from students rather than professors outside of certain aspects of the humanities. That, as he says in the title of his book, the coddling, this kind of coddling is us allowing a generation and now a couple generations of students to be fragile, to be less than resilient, to be people who think that the world is always going to bend to their way of thinking and to be responsive to them, and they're going to end up with a kind of childish notion that things should be the way they think they should be. I don't know what the question is in there, other than he goes on to talk about this notion of victimhood, and that if you're not being exposed to, again, provocative material, you're Well, another way to put it would be the way I think a lot of lawyers who are defending academic freedom put it when they're talking about these kinds of cases, and that is that you know, let good speech, let good arguments drive out bad. This notion of putting everything on the table. Even think of somebody like Andrew Sullivan, who I don't agree with on lots of things, but I'd rather have it there exposed so I can address it in the relatively safe confines of a classroom than not addressing it at all. Not addressing it allows it to continue to fester, to pop up in lots of other places, and we as society are just going to keep. In other words, I'll end with this. If you suppress a lot of what could be really harmful attitudes or expressions in a classroom, they're going to pop up in other places. You can't just do it behaviorally. You actually have to address the root of why somebody thinks that way. You have to address it cognitively and emotionally, I think he's saying. And the university is a great place to do that rather than a place that's more and more shutting it down. I think I'm representing him on that last point at least.
I want to say, up to a certain point, I agree with him. I don't want to get into the law school examples because the nature of legal disputation is going to be adversarial. But in terms of most contexts in an undergraduate classroom, it's one thing to create an environment where students can express their views on all sorts of controversial issues and exposing students to many different perspectives. I think that it's the obligation of instructors to provide students with the strongest versions of various views related to the subject matters that they teach. But there's ways that you can go about doing that is still respectful of students. It may be difficult at times depending on the subjects that you are discussing in class, but it is possible. And for those students who are concerned that just talking about a subject matter is a threat to them, instead of automatically saying that, oh, they're playing the victim card or it's a culture of victimhood, I think it's up to instructors to figure out why are students responding in that way to the discussion of this topic in the first place. It could be the case that after you have a genuine discussion with students that you disagree with how they're responding to you, and you would just need to deal with that disagreement. But it's not the initial, oh, they can't handle the conversation, therefore they're victims and we're coddling them. Instead, let's figure out why students are responding this way and that way to certain kinds of discussions of controversial issues.
Well, just quickly, and then we'll ask the two of you to come in. I think here's one of the things in the article that might flesh this out a bit. Part of it relates to his notions of what happened with parenting as well, that we've become overly protective and child-centric in ways in which, with the rise of social media and with the rise of certain kinds of at least perceived violence in society, parents have become much more protective, overbearing in there. And there seems to be some good evidence that is true. And that, along with the virtue signaling largely of white privileged students by aligning themselves and their causes with those who are quote unquote marginalized. Since the 1990s, there's been a change. The most sacred thing in a university right now is the victim. Not in all departments, not in the sciences, but in the social science and especially humanities. The victim is the most sacred thing. There's 6 groups of victims traditionally. Most, whenever there's big political blow-up and controversies, they tend to be around race issues, gender issues, or LGBTQ issues. Those are the big 3. And again, I think what he's worried about is that if you don't immediately virtue signal that you're on the side of that particular social justice slash political slash orthodoxy, there is no room or place for you really in the university these days. And so the signaling around that is that, you know, there are questionnaires that go out at certain universities. I don't even know if that's true here. I don't think so. You guys would know better than I. That what are you doing in your classroom? Chemistry professor got this at a different university. What are you doing in your classroom to address DEI issues? And this poor guy who's taught there for 20 or 25 years said, I have no idea what I'm doing around those issues. I don't see the relevance of that in chemistry. Now, he may well be dead wrong, and there may be lots of things that he could or should be doing, but as this particular slant of the argument looks at that and says, okay, that's an incursion of a social justice agenda into the pursuit of truth in this particular field. That's what's wrong with the university.
Leave it to the other panelists because I have a lot of thoughts about that one.
Should we flip a coin?
You can go first. I
I-
need to get my thoughts together on that. I do have a lot of thoughts on that.
On that. So I thought I keep trying to kind of climb back to the particular point from Haidt, but I thought again Dwayne made some good points in response. I mean, I do think part of it is so. First, I do want to say, you know, a culture of victimization and expectation not to have to respond or engage is also consistent with a certain kind of consumer culture that the customer is always right. I'm just going to throw that out there to connect back to the point I made about the university being in a difficult position in terms of how it's financed and what that means for maybe the expectations of students. But I agree, I don't think that's the whole story. I think it's definitely true that the way in which these things are presented, like there's so much that goes into making that classroom atmosphere the right one for that conversation to happen in a way that is not excessively adversarial or hostile or threatening or singling out particular students. There's so much that goes into that. It's very easy to fail. I mean, it's just very hard. Like it's always been a part of teaching, but I do think that, you know, Haidt is definitely right, 80s, 90s, zeros now, that our cultural and social sensitivity to this is greater. I think that counts as progress, all things told, okay? But it is an additional cognitive load that, you know, you're bringing into the classroom and that you're trying to manage. So trying to finesse that, so I'm talking from the professor side here. I do think then, I like the idea too, well, how do you respond when they think what you're saying, because you're talking about it at all, is hostile or harmful or threatening, and you want to say, no, you've misunderstood. You need to know this because it happened. Human nature hasn't changed that much. It could happen again. And to understand these things is part of what education is. And so you're having that back and forth, right? And there the worry is what you call the virtue signaling or the conformity or the shutting that down, like you can't be right. So what I worry is like just kind of a partial response to what Dwayne said is when the receptivity is not there, when either the curiosity or the willingness to take up that very generous and delicate conversation you offered to have isn't there. I mean, that is at least the image that Haidt, I think, is presenting us with. I struggle, you know, that you're in a really challenging place then. And you're also in a challenging place if you, as a professor, want to say, no, wait, look, I've done all this framing work, or at least I've tried to. Here's why I think this is really important. Here's why you're going to be better served. You know, and you need a certain amount of uptake. And sometimes you can get that, and sometimes you can't. And when you can't, I do think then you are in a difficult position there. Did you cross a line as a professor in the classroom? If that's what they decide to say, or, you know, are they just misunderstanding the educational process? Like there is a really delicate space there, and the attitudes on both sides matter. I guess I'm trying to walk a delicate line as well, but like that's how I would break that situation down. And I've probably failed, in both directions. I've seen failure in both directions. It's hard, but it is a more difficult balancing act now, I think, for a lot of different reasons.
The groups that he put into the victimhood category are groups that have, in fact, many things have happened to them over time that have created harm in those groups. Just call it what it is. Enslaved African times, all of the experimentation that was done to them, all of the oppression that was done to them, the fact that they couldn't buy houses, the fact that they couldn't go to college. There's so many inequities that exist. That part, I'm just going to leave that right there. The part where he's talking about parents, and he says that essentially in the 80s was when things started to change from a parental standpoint, and we started to coddle children differently. He talked about before that we left children unsupervised, and they were able to go through negative things like having students or having friends say things to them that may be harmful, or even getting into scraps with other individuals, and that helped to build this more resilient adult. I think I look at that differently, because I look at how many individuals who are adults now are broken because of the times that they were kids left unsupervised at home. That didn't build resilient adults, it built broken adults. And so, to say that us as parents providing a little bit more care in how we're raising our children, I can't say that's taking away from building this resilient adult, because the adults that were broken because of the things that happened to them in the past, we're now having to rebuild them, right? Through therapy and through lots of different mechanisms that are helping them to now become resilient adults. But it stemmed from the fact that they were broken to begin with. So I think that partly keeping more watchful eye on our children as they grow up actually is a better thing. Now, can we coddle too much? Absolutely. I have students whose parents are calling in instead of them calling in to address situations, not taking away from that. But in allowing them to not go through some of those things, we can start them off in a better place than we've started off some of those individuals that were broken in the beginning and had to be rebuilt. I think higher education, being in the classroom, having conversations that are difficult, I think that you can do that in a way that doesn't harm other individuals in the process. I think that you can moderate those discussions. I think that you can have open and honest discussions without creating more victims in the process of those discussions.
I certainly don't disagree with you. It makes me think of a classroom discussion. I was on Zoom. It was during the pandemic, and the best student in the class by any measure was a woman of mixed race background, and she was listening to us have this conversation, kind of back and forth. I think it was on affirmative action, and some of these cases came up where there was, some older white professor got singled out on some incident or event that most of the rest of the class thought was maybe on the face of it absurd, or the punishment didn't fit the crime. And she sat there and listened for a long time, and she finally, spoke up, and she said, "Look, I think along the lines of what you're saying, Alicia, generations and generations and generations of people who look like me, have been on the receiving end of what this guy said. If the pendulum swings too far for a minute, look, I'm sorry for him. I'm not sorry that, there's a certain greater sensitivity to what I and the people I represent have gone through." And it was a sobering moment, I think, for the rest of the class. Was everything fair and just and equitable? Not necessarily, but in terms of balancing the scales, we're going to make some mistakes along the way in both in certainly the direction that she was suggesting was like sorry, not sorry, was what she was basically saying. And like who really needs to be resilient here, I think was her question. Dwayne more on this before I give Height one last chance?
I would say go ahead and give Height one last chance.
All right, from his moral psychologist perspective, he is worried that somehow, again, in this agenda that we need to be create a very safe place, that college is full of all kinds of dangerous ideas that might harm people. He says, the idea that words, ideas, and speakers could invalidate someone's existence is so threatening that we need protections, that we need trigger warnings is from his point of view, counterproductive. Because the net effect is that the very people you're trying to help are rendered weaker and they become moral dependents. They become morally dependent. Let me give an example. This is 2016, right? 2 weeks ago, when we had the Trump-Clinton debate at Hofstra University, and for the Hofstra students coming in, there was a signed trigger warning because Donald Trump is there. So he's triggering all by himself. So, quote, the event conducted may contain triggers, sexual violence, sexual assault. If you feel triggered, please know there are resources to support you. And it lists 5 different organizations you can go to for support if you feel upset by Trump's presence. And Height's claim is this is a textbook case of moral dependency. Why? The reason why this is so bad for students is because of the other big psychological idea I wanted to share with you, which is anti-fragility, which he actually uses in place of resilience. He makes a distinction there between resilience, you hit something, it doesn't get any worse, but it doesn't get any better. His notion of anti-fragility, which is borrowing, is that if you go through these crucibles and come out the other side of them, you don't sort of go immediately for help, to be protected, to be, able to avoid these ideas in any way. You end up anti-fragile, which is actually an improvement in your personality profile. So that's where he goes. And I know we've talked about this, we've covered some of this already, but if you have any last or closing thoughts on that.
Some people don't have the privilege of continually going through the encounters of ideas that, if they're implemented by others, can lead to policies that negatively affects their lives.
Whole populations based on just being part of that population.
So he's missing a fundamental or crucial point about who's showing up at college and may be vulnerable to these right from the bat. And he's thinking that, the more experiences you have like this, the better off you're going to be. You're both suggesting, look, there are whole groups of people who had enough of these experiences, thank you very much. And him not addressing that renders some of this really beyond the pale.
Yeah, unwarranted overgeneralization.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem that he has is similar to what a lot of people do when they appropriate John Stuart Mills's approach to the expression of ideas. Mills's understanding of I don't want to use marketplace of ideas because Mill himself doesn't quite use that term, but the idea that if you can just get people to be introduced to ideas that may be difficult for them, and that they can encounter those ideas, learn from them, be able to respond why they disagree with those ideas, then it's better for them by going through the process. I'm calling that. For some people, yes, and some of the time. For others, yes. But that presumes a whole lot of, at times, socioeconomic privilege. At other times, a lot of a privileging of people who have the temperament not to care when other people push back against their fundamentally held beliefs. It assumes that the ideas that are being articulated will not become the foundation for policies that actually make entire groups of people worse off because they're not only aired, but they're implemented politically.
I'm out of his arguments, I'm sorry.
Well, and I mean, part of I think the point here, I mean, we might grant some version of the thesis that you need to engage with ideas and challenge, and in doing so, that's part of an educational process and that makes you stronger. I think we could grant that very general claim, but which challenges and up to what point are going to make you better off and stronger rather than not do depend on the standpoint you're coming from. And as we've pointed out, and I think the political examples are interesting with these political speeches that happen on campus, you're not just in the ivory tower of ideas anymore. I mean, you are on the cusp of implementation. So the idea would be we might grant the general thesis, but we have to recognize, some people have already been through a crucible. And hopefully that hasn't resulted only in trauma and brokenness, but some resilience. But that crucible itself was unjust. And that may be, when we say, oh, you need to confront this to have it make you stronger, we have to think about who we're saying that to. I mean, I think that's part of the point. What does it mean to become stronger and to have education do that? And surely it shouldn't be gratuitous. I mean, that we just insult people or just create whatever turmoil we can. I mean, there has to be a little bit more nuance. And perhaps this is one talk. I don't mean to necessarily say this is Haidt's view, but I think this nuance matters, and that too is why the way in which the ideas get presented and the way in which conveying respect, at least when I think about students in the classroom, is so important and such a delicate thing to manage. That's what I would add, I guess.
And the statements that he's making are coming from a place of privilege. If you're an individual who has, from the time they were a child, had several things happen to you that have broken you as a person, and it be based on the fact that you're from a particular group of individuals that are socially devalued within our society, are part of those historically marginalized groups, then yes, there should be some trigger warnings, because there are going to be things that are going to impact them differently than the person that's coming from a place of privilege that didn't have any of those experiences. Now you are, in fact, triggering me, or maybe making me feel unsafe in the classroom, or making me feel harm, or reopening an old wound that then creates further trauma. So now you're walking around with several individuals on a campus that are traumatized based on you making a statement coming from a place of privilege and not having to deal with those same things when you're having those discussions, bringing those identities to the table with you. That's going to be part of the discussion. You can't separate yourself from that. You can't separate yourself from that identity or from those experiences in order to come to the table fresh and new from that privileged vantage point. It's not possible.
And that is one of the main problems with Haidt's position. He thinks that you can do that, or it's implied in how he frames this discussion in this specific speech.
I certainly don't disagree with you. Let me try one last time, before I become really uncomfortable with myself, even more than I am. But to come back around, he's concerned about what goes missing. This sort of harkens back a little bit to Andrew's place, and I'm cognizant of the makeup of the panel, and maybe Andrew and I are coming from a place where, I'll speak for myself, not you, where right, I feel maybe more comfortable to wade into some of this for just reasons of cultural background and general insensitivity. How do I know? I think there's a certain body of knowledge, referring to this earlier, some or references to some things individually or collectively that are horrific and yet important to understand causes of, etc. I don't know a priori who that might affect or how. If I say, look, this is going to be difficult material, those of you who may find yourself having difficulty with it are exempt or excluded from that. Is that helpful or again, now I feel like I'm making a false dichotomy myself. I guess I'll put it this way, do you have any sympathy for professors who wonder, okay, what should I do? What can I do? What do I need to know that would still allow me to teach in a way that feels like it has integrity, but it's responsive to this new, broader, more inclusive, more sensitive notion of the world we're trying to build.
And I'm sympathetic to faculty who find themselves in that position because in my role, I talk to faculty who find themselves in this position, either because there has been a student complaint against them or because they seek me out given my role in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, or they just would like to learn more about diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, and belonging, and how to integrate that into the classroom. And when faculty come to me to have these conversations, I acknowledge that finding the right balance between teaching students in such a way that you're communicating the content to them, and some of that content can potentially harm them, at the very least psychologically, if not also create conditions if other people take it up that can actually harm them physically with the implementation of those ideas and policy, that there is a way that you can teach, I would say, quite a few controversial subject matters, but also create an environment where you're not worrying about which specific student or students that you're going to offend, but rather how do you frame this in such a way that it accommodates as many students who will be listening to you as possible. There are techniques that exist that you can teach to faculty how to do this well. You can acknowledge that there are going to be some times when students are going to be offended at things that, as an institution, we may have to be sympathetic to how the student feels. But at least in my role, sometimes I defend the faculty member in terms of how they delivered the content. But I also recommend in those instances that the faculty member learn more about how to teach that content. And going back several minutes ago with the chemistry faculty member who received the survey about how are you integrating DEI into your classroom, it matters quite a bit for certain student populations in how you approach them in the first place in the classroom. Do you treat them as though they already belong in, if you're teaching a lab course? Do they already belong in the lab? Do you think that they have something to contribute to the classroom? Or are you viewing them from a deficit mindset and you're going, okay, I'm here to teach students who don't know what I want them to know, how to do it, and until they prove that they know this, then I can welcome them into the hallowed halls of academia as apprentices. So I'm going, yeah, there. And if you're not thinking about those things in 2023, that's a problem.
Yeah, that asset-based thinking is because we have been programmed for years to think about deficit. If this group isn't performing this way, then it's a deficit. When we should be looking at the opportunities. It's opportunity gaps, not deficit gaps. You know, you talk about chemistry and the fact that this person's thinking, how do I integrate DEI into the classroom? How, into a chemistry class? Well, what types of, when you're talking about theory, what theorists are you bringing in? Are you talking about a diverse group of theorists? It matters because representation does matter. And when you have students in the classroom who don't hear anything about them from their identity standpoint, then you're not creating opportunities for DEI in the classroom. I argue you could have DEI in any class. It's just what you choose to present in that class. I've heard people say, Well, I'm in an anatomy physiology class. I teach this. I can't bring diversity in. Well, what do your models look like? Are they different? Do you have different representation of different groups in your models that you're bringing in? How do you talk about how anatomy, through some diagnostic tests may be a little bit different based on skin color, so on and so forth. There's lots of different things you can come in and bring in to create diversity in the classroom. But the inclusion piece, if you're looking at the group that has suffered the most, and you're making sure that you're correcting for those types of things that have happened that have created harm to that group, you're going to create an inclusive classroom for everyone in that classroom, and so it's going to be better regardless for every student that enters, and not just those students that are part of that particular group that may have been devalued in the past.
Well said. I would have to leave it to Height to respond because I've got nothing. That seems to make perfect sense to me. Can I ask you to do this by way of concluding here? Can I circle back and ask you to say just a couple words, each one of you, about, okay, at the end of the day, this is what I believe the purpose of the university writ large, and specifically Grand Valley State University to be?
Andrew, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'll give it a shot. The purpose.
You've thought about this, Andrew.
I have. Well, I have thought about it, but even our conversation here today feels me. I want to make sure to appropriately qualify what I say. I mean, I led by saying that I'm very sympathetic with Height's idea that the fundamental animating definition of the university has to do with this intellectual engagement with truth, right? And I still think that is essentially correct. I don't buy all the different dichotomies that he is selling. I'm very sympathetic with, I think, broad conversation we've had here. But I do think that that's correct. I think the goal of the university is to help people develop. So in the traditional conception, right, and we talked about this here at GVSU, of the liberal arts or the liberal education is training to be a free person, which means not just living in a society that doesn't put a lot of constraints on you, but actually having the talents, the capacities, the habits of thought, the knowledge, the background to govern yourself, to live your life effectively. Ideally, to live your life, well and morally, but at least to govern it in a certain sort of way. So there is that very general sort of set of capacities that I think an education is about, and I do think that is the purpose of a university. That being said, I just want to qualify. Height talks a lot about the possibility of bias. He talks about motivated reasoning, and of course he's worried about that coming in politically. But when we talk about truth and these launch ideas of the university, we should recognize that too can function as a sort of cover for other commitments or motivations. You talked about the history, the actual real anthropological history of the university, and it's not pretty. Like, I wouldn't hold that up and say, that's how it should have gone. Yeah. So we always have to be on our guard, even if we say what I just said about truth and understanding and the liberal education, that we're not just putting up a particular prejudiced image of what those things are and, setting that as the ideal, because then we do define the institution in a way that can be contingently, arbitrarily, and unjustly exclusionary. So that's the kind of caveat that I would add there.
I'll let you go next, Dwayne.
I guess I need to revisit something that I mentioned in my opening statement. My criticism of the objectivity of knowledge. With respect to, I don't even like using the term university. I'm forced to do so because I work at Grand Valley State University and most of the people I interact with think in terms of university. But I think what most colleges and universities actually are multiversities. They serve many different functions and roles depending on the stakeholders who are part of them. And when it comes to the objectivity of knowledge, this idea that there is a way that things are, that we just discover them through inquiry, is something that I honestly do not believe is an accurate way of thinking about the structure of reality, nor is it an adequate way of thinking about how scientific inquiry actually unfolds. I'm a strong believer in terms of intersubjectivity and using various standards and methods in order to investigate certain phenomena in the world, if you're talking about either the social sciences or natural sciences. But as our techniques change and as the questions that we ask change, then the knowledge that's derived from the inquiry is going to change. And then to ask whether that's the way that things really are, or is it really objective in the sense of you can separate our perceptions and our biases and our commitments out of the inquiry and the results of it. I just think that we honestly need to rethink that model of knowledge. And when it comes to the university, we should also, as Andrew rightfully points out, look at the commercial dimension of universities. Universities are businesses. Honestly, they're businesses. You have budgets, you have priorities. Universities are the economic engines of the communities that they belong to. They provide resources and services. They provide jobs. That's a function of the university. And plus, they're innovators. They create techniques and equipment and other things that you can patent, which then the university make money off of. There's other things that the university does, but I know that I've taken up quite a bit of time, so I should just stop now.
Thank you.
These two went really deep with it. I think it's deep explanations. Mine's a little bit more simple than that. I think that universities, or what do you call them, multiversities? I like that, multiversities. That universities should be a place where individuals can come and at any given age, that 18 and up, to get into the institution, but that can be a place where they can explore. I think being able to explore new subjects, being able to explore new groups of individuals, being able to explore who they are, their own identity is as a person. I think that that's part of it. I think that's part of the learning that happens at a higher education institution. I think being able to provide them the opportunity, provide everyone the opportunity to be here. And not just certain groups or based on meritocracy, but every person have the opportunity to be here, to be able to take away from it whatever it is that they need to take away from it in order to be who they want to be in society. I think we're here to make individuals better, and I say better in the sense of they know more, they can do more, they can make changes, they can be agents of change within the community, so on and so forth. I think that those are the individuals that we should be creating and giving them the space in order to explore to get to that particular level. And I think that in the space, it also has to be inclusive. They should feel like they belong here. They should feel like they're going to be treated fairly and equitably, and that the way that they're treated isn't based on how they identify. I do think that we have to create spaces of belonging for many groups of individuals, but it shouldn't actually be like that. The environment should be so inclusive that we don't have to create spaces specifically for groups of individuals because they don't feel like they belong on campus. We need to create opportunities. We need to create spaces. We need to create an institution that is inclusive and allows everyone to be here and to be their authentic selves here and to be able to learn what it is that they need to learn in order to make changes to themselves, to society, whatever they deem important. So a lot simpler than you two's answers, but
I want to thank all three of you for your willingness to take the time, take up what's obviously a difficult and large conversation and question, and your eloquence and passion in doing so. Height will just have to fend for himself going forward. But again, can't thank you enough for sharing your thoughts. Truly appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity.